request on the dais Mr. Cyrus Kamau Kiwua, who is the Chief Scientist, Infrastructure Engineering and ICT, National Commission for Science, Technology and Innovation, Republic of Kenya, for a brief introduction to the ITEC program.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Cyrus Kamau Kiwua. I'm the acting chief scientist in the ICT and Infrastructure Engineering in the State Department of Science, Technology and Innovation of Kenya. I want to do a short and brief introduction to ITEC. I'll start now. Since 1964, the Indian Technical Economic Cooperation Program and the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, has been providing capacity building programs in various domains to delegates from 161 ITEC partner countries from Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe, Latin America, the Caribbean, as well as the Pacific, and small islands of the Caribbean countries. These programs have generated immense goodwill and substantive cooperation among the developing countries and have perceived as a harbinger to the South-South cooperation. RIS, which is our current host and program, which is a research for information system for developing countries, has been conducting 3 capacity building programs under the ITEC program. This program, which is science diplomacy, is on its 2nd edition, where the 1st edition was last year, 2017, and is designed to expose participants in theory and practice of science diplomacy and how developing nations can use and benefit from science diplomacy. I would stop there and say, as a key, that's one thing I'll be looking forward to see where I can learn in this area. So apart from that is that the science diplomacy, the course includes lectures, case studies, self-study, group discussions, and field visits. There are 32 delegates from 21 countries participating in this program this year. Thank you and welcome.
May I now request Ms. Hither Hollow and Mr. Arya Das from the New York University to give an introduction to their group and also welcome our distinguished delegates.
Good morning and namaste. Before we get started with today's sessions, I would like to thank RIS and Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, the Director General, on behalf of myself and my colleagues for kindly hosting us. We are graduate students of New York University, and we are candidates for a Master of Science in Global Affairs. Many of us are focusing on different areas such as transnational security, energy, the private sector, international law and human rights, and development. We are a diverse group of students, with some from Palestine, the Philippines, El Salvador, and Peru. We are here in India to study the country's reemergence as a regional and global power, as well as its geopolitical concerns. With us today is Clinical Professor WPS Sidhu and our School Dean, Dr. Vera Jelinek. And to say a few words about Professor Chaturvedi, he is the Director General of RIS and has an extensive background in issues regarding cooperation policies and South-South cooperation. Some of the organizations he has worked with include the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, World Bank, UNESCO, and India's Department of Biotechnology and Ministry of Environment and Forests. We are delighted to be here today with RIS and to learn more about the organization's work. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Arya Das. I'm also a master's student here with NYU. I'm here to introduce Mr. Jairam Ramesh. As many of you already know, but this is mostly for the people from New York University as well as for the larger audience. Mr. Ramesh is a member of parliament currently representing the state of Karnataka in the Rajya Sabha. He's a prominent member of the Indian National Congress Party. He's previously held various designations at the highest level. He was the member of parliament for the state of Andhra Pradesh. He's also a former Minister of Rural Development, as well as a former Minister of State and independent charge for the Ministry of Environment and Forests. In terms of education, he holds a Bachelor of Technology degree from Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, IIT Bombay, as well as a Master of Science in Public Policy and Public Management from Carnegie Mellon University's Heinz College. Many of us know him on the global stage for being the chief negotiator for India at the United Nations Climate Change Conference in the Copenhagen Summit in 2009. His exploits on the stage of environment are also exemplified in his recent book, Indira Gandhi, A Life in Nature, which is a story about the naturalist as well as the conservation policies of the late Prime Minister. He is a distinguished author with some of his recent books, including An Old History, New Geography, which was about the formation of the state of Telangana, the newest state in the Indian Republic, as well as To the Brink and Back, India's 1991 story, which is about the remarkable economic changes that took place in India at the federal level in the year 1991 and onwards. So, with a loud round of applause for Mr. Jairam Ramesh.
It's time for another of our ITEC colleague, Ms. Maria Florencia Colados, who is a Foreign Trade Officer, Santa Fe Government Investment and Foreign Trade Agency, Argentine Republic. She would introduce Ms. Ambassador Ramasina and Dr. Esar Rao.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Maria Florencia Collados. I am from Argentina, and I work in Santa Fe Santa Fe Province Government in the Investment and Foreign Trade Agency. It is a great pleasure of being here, sharing this course with you. But right now, I'm here to introduce the ambassador, Mr. Amar Sina, and Dr. Rao. Both of them have a huge curriculum vitae, so excuse me, but I'm going to read them. Mr. Ambassador Sina was a career diplomat with about 35 years of experience in the Indian Foreign Service. He had served in different capacities in Indian missions around the world, including Algiers, Buenos Aires, Washington, D.C., Jakarta, and Brussels. He served as India's ambassador to Tajikistan and Afghanistan and was the Secretary of Economic Relations in the Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi. His portfolio included relations with all countries in Africa, Gulf, and West Asia region, development partnership, trade and investment promotion, and all multilateral economic work such as BRICS. He also served as ex officio director on the board of Exim Bank of India, and on his retirement from the diplomatic service last year, he has been appointed as a director of the board of Hindustan Petroleum Corporation, and also serves on the board of Barefoot College in India, a non-profit organization. He joined the RIS as a distinguished fellow in November 2017, and has lent support to several think tanks focused on Afghanistan and other issues. He also advises Chambers of Commerce on trade and investment issues. He's an economic graduate from Patna University, and he speaks Hindi, English, French, and Spanish fluently, and is familiar with Dari. Mr. Rao is an advisor in the Department of Biotechnology at the Ministry of Science and Technology of the Indian government. He's graduate in agriculture with PhD in mycology and plant pathology from Indian Agricultural Research Institute in New Delhi. He was postdoctoral fellow in Tottori University in Japan, and visiting scientist at Wade Agriculture Experimental Station in Australia. He has been actively involved in establishment of several sophisticated biotech infrastructure facilities, forging bilateral collaboration and formulation of national biotech policies. He has published research papers in national and international journals and made several presentations in different national and international conferences. Thanks.
May I request Chair Ambassador Sinha to take the floor, sir.
Distinguished panelists on the dais, members of the ITEC and students of the New York University, a very warm welcome to India. Today we had thought that we are going to talk about science diplomacy. We have two very distinguished speakers who will be speaking to you on that. But as a practicing diplomat, let me tell you why science diplomacy has become a new word or something that has to be implemented. See, traditionally, as we know of diplomacy, it was more of flag flying, making contacts, reporting on political developments, promoting trade and commerce. But increasingly, science diplomacy has become the center of diplomatic activity. And mainly because as we move, today as you understand, or as we understand, that the currency of a national power really is the strength of your economy. Economy drives from your ability to produce goods and services and innovate. And actually, if you look around you, the best products that you have are innovative products. I'm sure all of you have Apple iPhones in your pockets or the Samsung S8. These are all examples of great innovation. Now, whether you take some basic issues like health, education, sanitation, drinking water, which is more perhaps salient to the developing countries, right from there to the latest products, including in defense and space and all sectors that you see, unless the economies can produce themselves, they will remain dependent on others, and they would really, in many manners, not be able to exercise the national power that we all know. Then why? Because in ITEC, we focus more on developing countries. It has become increasingly important for developing countries also to cooperate in science and technology for a few simple reasons, because their problems are unique. Some of the problems that you still face of development, whether it's in health or education, may or may not be concerns in the developed world where they are focusing on different issues. So that is one. Second, there is also an issue of how much economies or countries can absorb. The absorption level determines also what sort of technology needs to be brought in. So diplomats are extremely aware of what to look out for and what could be absorbed in their own economies, both in terms of absorption capacity, but importantly also affordability. Of course, there are many things which are desirable, but is it affordable at a certain stage of development? And the answer clearly is no. So that is why you all would have heard about the term frugal innovation, where India actually leads in many sectors in terms of frugal innovation. And of course, this also leads to, while science and technology diplomacy helps in collaboration, helps in knowledge sharing, but then it also leads to a perpetual debate that we have globally, and a regime has developed on the conflict between propagation, free propagation of knowledge, and the protection of intellectual property rights. That is something, as students of global affairs, all of you will have to be extremely conscious and mindful. I will leave it to the experts to tell you more, but these were just my few observations as a practicing diplomat, and I think within ITEC, there's a huge scope of improving, particularly in health, and actually meeting all the SDG goals. If you look at the SDG goals, these are really the building blocks of any country or an economy. So welcome. With the ITEC participants, of course, we will have other opportunities to interact, but welcome to Delhi and welcome to RIS. Thank you.
May I now request our Director General, Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, to add his words of welcome.
Thank you, Sabyasachi. Warm welcome to RIS and as Ambassador Sinha said, to Delhi. We today have in this room two groups, as you have already gathered. One is students from New York University, thanks to WPS for getting the students here with us. and the other group is, as Ambassador Amar Sinha mentioned, of the students or the participants at the science diplomacy course. So those of us who are studying, trying to understand what role science diplomacy can play, we would be together for next 10 days or so for discussing some of these issues. As you would see, the agenda today after the lunch would go on a track in which we would explore themes related to the theoretical and conceptual framework of science diplomacy, how it is defined, what it entails, how we move forward. Then we have tried to capture some of the key advances that India has made in science technology and innovation, and how we are sharing that with developing countries. Later in the course, we move forward in terms of leveraging the great strength India had in terms of getting partner countries together. And friends, this commitment of India is there not now, but from many, many years. When before India became independent in 1947, in 1946, we had a provisional government which had to switch over. And we started a major training course in Indian Agriculture Research Institute, IARI Pusa, from where Dr. Rao comes. At this institute, the first Prime Minister of India, Pandit Nehru, thought of inviting scholars from China and Indonesia for training. And that time, as I said, it was a provisional government. So the Viceroy of the Britain didn't allow, but Nehru prevailed. And in 1946, we got around 30 scholars, 15 from China and 15 from Indonesia. And right in 48 itself, Nehru launched a major program with 75 scholars in India. And that was the beginning of India's efforts for capacity building. The ITEC program, for which we are here together for science diplomacy, was actually launched way back in 1964. But our engagement with capacity building started as early as 1946. And 1948 onwards, we had these 75 fellowships for people coming from outside. So that has been the commitment and logic for sharing with our partner countries. So with that, we have been moving forward in terms of how we are moving forward in terms of our partnership, and the idea of whatever little progress India is making, we should be sharing it with fellow developing countries. In science, technology, innovation, the idea is also to showcase some of our advancements, and for the science diplomacy participants, some field trips have been planned to our solar alliance, to the solar production units that are there. And also, friends, as Ambassador Amar Sinha very rightly said, science is now intrinsically linked with our economic progress and also with our trade areas. So later in the course, you would find a couple of lectures trying to link science with trade, economy, and the larger achievement of sustainable development goals. So that is the larger span of issues and range of issues that we would be capturing under science diplomacy. The New York University students today are here only for a day with us. And during this, apart from the key presentations that we would have just now, we have also lined up a couple of themes for you in the course of the day to capture the advancement that we are witnessing in terms of economic progress in science technology, but also on how we see the larger issues coming out of multilateralism, the democratic development in India, and economic growth. So it's a very rich agenda for both the groups. The connecting fulcrum comes in from a lecture that we have requested Professor Thomas Pogge to deliver right after this session, where he would be capturing the idea of India's role and the larger global governance related issues. And this brings in both the participants from science diplomacy course, but also the NYU students in terms of where do we see that connect coming in? what are the ways science, society, larger democratic setups, and bigger economies play. So that would be Thomas Pogge's lecture. We have also requested Professor Miltos Ledikas to stay back. Both of them were here for a meeting last week at RIS on a project we have launched on intellectual property rights. And this project is extremely interesting. It is funded by European Commission, and we are trying to see that if you are not undermining the authority of the patent regime, what are the alternatives that we have? It's important to have patent regime because you want to encourage innovation, but it is also equally important that, as Ambassador Amar Sinha rightly emphasized, affordability. So how you can have patent regime in place, and you also have public policy objective of making the advancements in technology affordable to people. So how do you balance the two? And there is an interesting project, and when I was at Yale, Professor Thomas Pogge had already developed a project, an idea of health impact fund. And this is one important way. We are in Kerala trying to do a pilot project with a couple of pharmaceutical firms to see how their patented drugs are made available to patients at an affordable cost. And that cost is borne through a fund, and the fund is called Health Impact Fund. But it is important that the efficacy of the drug should be compensating the royalty which is being charged on the medicine. So it's extremely important and exciting project which Thomas Pogge has developed. He would be the one talking to you after this till the lunch session, and then with the science diplomacy group, we have requested Professor Miltos to talk to you on technology assessment. What are the criteria that we should have for assessment of technology? But now in the rest of the session, as we had promised you, this would be extremely interactive session. I would request Dr. Jairam Ramesh and Dr. S.R. Rao to speak for 8 to 10 minutes to give their broad ideas. As you heard, both of them are having huge intellectual accomplishments with them, apart from the positions that they are holding. This intellectual strength is our gain today, this morning. So they would speak for a few minutes, and then it would be open for questions. First, we would have that session with Dr. Jairam Ramesh, and then with Dr. S.R. Rao. So, Dr. Jairam Ramesh, please feel free to speak from there.
I think the temptation to speak longer is when you stand behind a lectern. So I will speak for about a few minutes. My remarks will be based on my experience in multilateral diplomacy. I'll leave the commercials for bilateral diplomacy to my colleagues. So and I want to focus on the multilateral part of science diplomacy, and my experience will be drawn largely from the interactions I had over a long period of time in the field of environment. Well, the most successful example of multilateral diplomacy, which integrated science with diplomacy in the field of environment, is the Montreal Protocol. It's the protocol that was signed for controlling the depletion of the ozone layer. The depletion of the ozone layer was first discovered by a trio of scientists who got the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in the mid-90s. That woke up the world to the fact that the ozone layer was being depleted with deleterious consequences for human beings. Countries got together and ultimately signed the Montreal Protocol. And today we can say confidently, based on science, that the depletion has been reversed. So this is a successful example of where science was used initially to identify the problem, and then countries got together to arrive at an agreement. Every country took on responsibility, and over a period of about 15 years, the world community developed confidence to say that the depletion of the ozone layer is no longer a major environmental hazard. So this is a good example of science diplomacy in a multilateral context. A weak example of science diplomacy in the multilateral context is the climate change agreement, where the world community negotiated, discussed for almost 2 decades, and finally, in Paris in 2015, based on agreements reached at Copenhagen in 2009 and Cancun in 2010, finally the world community arrived at an agreement for controlling global warming, which proved contentious, as you know, with the United States announcing its intention to withdraw from the year 2020. Now, my experience in both these areas, both in the case of the Montreal Protocol as well as in the Paris Agreement and in the events leading up to these agreements, the first point I'd like to make is that in both these areas, there was a scientific mobilization as a precursor to diplomacy. Diplomacy was not based on one man's opinion or newspaper articles or somebody's fears. It was based on hard science, whether it was the depletion of the ozone layer or whether it was on the global warming. In fact, as many of you know, the Nobel Prize for 2007 was given to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which must remain a unique network of scientists across the world community. They don't do science by themselves, but what they do is they create an international consensus on peer-reviewed science publications. And this is a very interesting, unique model of science collaboration, which has not been replicated in other areas, but certainly has played a very major role in arousing world consciousness on global warming and climate change. So the first requirement was the fact that there was a scientific community. There was a scientific community, the network that got created, the scientific community results were put in digestible form, and this got fed into the governments who were actually doing the negotiations. So the negotiations that took place were based on science, were based on published science, very important. The second aspect is that in all these negotiations, we had an institutional anchor. We had an organization that got created under the aegis for the Montreal Protocol. We had the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework for Climate Change Convention, created for climate change. So you have an institutional anchor. An institutional anchor means it's rules-based. An institutional anchor means that these rules are negotiated. They're not imposed by one or two or three powerful parties, but they are basically negotiated through a process of give and take. So this institutional anchor, the need for international institutions, which will be the anchor for diplomacy, was a second major ingredient of both these efforts. A third aspect of these negotiations was the fact that these negotiations involved multiple strands. It involved finance, it involved technology transfer, it involved countries taking on commitments. The nature of those commitments, of course, vary. But the point I want to make is that the negotiations, the diplomacy, was nothing is agreed to till everything is agreed to. This was the philosophy that underlied the WTO. This is also the philosophy that underpinned climate change and environmental agreements, that you don't pick and choose. You don't get the agreement till all the elements of the agreement are actually in place. And this is where diplomacy really plays a very important role. Because it's very easy in the world of diplomacy, it's very easy to have plurilateral agreements. It's very difficult to have multilateral agreements. A plurilateral agreement is an agreement where like-minded countries get together and say, we will do something about it. A multilateral agreement is when all the countries actually get together and decide to do something. In climate change, for example, it's very easy to have a bilateral agreement or a plurilateral agreement, but it's very difficult to have an agreement where 193 countries actually agree on something to be done. So if you're going to have a multilateral agreement, it's very, very important to have institutions. It's very, very important to have rules. And it's also very important for countries to enter these negotiations in a spirit of give and take, where you give in some area, you take in some area. And that's why this whole philosophy that nothing is negotiated till everything is negotiated is very, very important. I don't want to say anything more at this stage. We'll make it more interactive. But I would say that one, the Montreal Protocol is a successful example. The climate change agreement is not a particularly good example. It's a weak agreement, and we can discuss why it's a weak agreement. But it exemplifies the fact that all these agreements are fundamentally agreements of an intergovernmental nature. And when you have diplomacy involving governments, governments tend to maximize the political and economic gains rather than maximize environmental gains. So particularly in the field of environment, I would argue that when I went to negotiate, my priority first was to protect the political sovereignty of India. Second was to enhance the economic interest of India. And third was to enhance environmental stewardship. I mean, I'm being very brutal and very honest about it. And I was not an exception. I think everybody who went took part in this multilateral negotiations followed this hierarchy of objectives. So I think one should realize that when you're in the diplomatic arena and when governments are involved, there's a lot of compromise that takes place. So you don't end up getting a first best solution. You may end up getting a second best solution, like we did in the case of Paris.
Thank you, Dr. Ramesh. May I now request Dr. S.R. Rao?
Good morning. I think first of all, I thank RIS for giving me this opportunity. And you already heard the discussions are already heating up on the panel. Actually, RIS and Sachin are very tricky people. So they have put three types of people on the dais. One is from diplomacy, one is from political and economic angle, the third is science. I'm talking on behalf of science. So let me choose that part. I think it was rightly said by the minister, the honorable MP, science mobilizes diplomacy. I think in the initial days, when we started, as history was being narrated by Sachin, I reminded myself that me and Sachin used to work a lot on, along with probably sometimes Amar Sinha, in Indo-ASEAN relations. So we used to be thickly involved in Indo-ASEAN and Indo-Africa programs and many Asian countries. That time, the interaction between science and diplomacy was driven by science, as science mobilizing diplomacy, as Jairam Ramesh puts it. And that was true. And what happened, that was very simple at that time. The scientists meet and they have a global agreement signed by some politicians. We just make a protocol of cooperation. We have a brainstorming. We agree for certain modalities of money and certain modalities of research. There ends the matter. Then cost 90s, late 90s. Late 90s, what happened was that science for diplomacy started. It was science in diplomacy earlier, then science for diplomacy started. Then science was searching for the foreign offices to facilitate the arrangement between scientists. So we started slowly depending on diplomacy. That is because at that time, because I have a 28 years of experience in government doing these collaborations, implementing them, funding them, sharing them, fighting with them and everything. So, and then not sharing some secrets, sharing their secrets, whatever. So the thing is that science for diplomacy started late 90s, in where a lot of developments globally was happening. Biotechnology was developing, genetic engineering, then genome sequencing, everything was developing. Then on the other side, nuclear sciences was in peak, chemical sciences was also in peak, pharmaceutical industry growth was recording very peaks, and it's a peak period actually. And then there were issues of Earth Summit, biodiversity, people were talking about their own ownership on the biodiversity, and there was a climate change being realized. Then WTO came in picture, WIPO became active. So, I mean, it's a, in Hindi we call it kashmakash. It is a very, very tough period between late 90s to early 2000. So during that period, what happened? The diplomacy for science started. So we have, the scientist is in trouble now. The scientist, to do a simple science, you have to go through all these perimeters, all these agreements, all these laws, legislations. So it becomes very tough to do science. For example, innovations are patented, accessibility, affordability, these things became very important. Then biodiversity, access to biodiversity is under laws. So whether your biodiversity being exported to other person. So earlier germplasm exchange of biodiversity for useful purposes through an agreement or a small material transfer agreement was possible. But today, the same thing, you require an approval from a central body within each country, whether I can do it or not. So the science has become complicated because of the diplomacy. A lot of diplomacy and what so-called multilateral collaborations. And some of them are legally binding, some of them are very loose. And then came in the picture, the science also became complicated because of issues like, transboundary movement of materials. Particularly if you see genetically engineered organisms, too many rules and regulations, even to exchange research material, have come in place. So the biosafety issues came in. Then as we entered, then it became very important in the health sector. H1N1 came, the new anthrax was spread into populations using the in US. Then the whole area of biological and chemical weapon conventions became very rampant in terms of discussions how to deal with these newly weaponized systems. So then biological, even to deal with, for example, tuberculosis pathogen, it becomes very tough because it is classified as risk-3 organism. So if you want to work on a vaccine of tuberculosis, you have to really struggle taking so many approvals because it is under the risk-3 organism of biosecurity regime. Even if you want to work on brucellosis, a disease which affects animals and humans, which is endemic in many developing countries, but it is a biothreat agent in US. So the technologies are available, but in the context of biothreat. But transfer of those technologies for you, because you are endemic, your populations and animals are suffering, is very tough, because there is a biosecurity tag attached to it. So now diplomacy overtakes science. So there is, if you see the discussions in multilateral negotiations, scientists are on the behind, and mostly the diplomats talk science now. So this has become a bit of a, so there should be a consultative mechanism, there should be a stakeholders inside each government. There should be a group of stakeholders where everybody is balancedly represented so that the negotiations are more appropriate at the international level, which anyway are being taken over by diplomats and administrators. Now, the last one I would like to say, with all these with all these regimes and with all these agreements, with all these troubles, science is progressing nevertheless very well. Because science goes on irrespective of this. And particularly on the issue of access and affordability, India and many other countries have excellent models. For example, we have a rotaviral vaccine developed on our own, which used to cost us something like 800 rupees for a prick. For example, hepatitis B vaccine, which is a genetically engineered one, when it was introduced by a multinational here, it used to cost us 1,200 rupees for a prick. It is very difficult for poor population to have 1,200 rupees spent, because sometimes that may be the salary at that time of a per month salary of people. So what has happened was, India took up this challenge through international collaboration, bilateral relations, technology was transferred. Today, the hepatitis B vaccine, Indian companies are able to supply at 18 rupees, 1/8. That is almost 1/5 of a dollar. So, technology, for example, rotaviral vaccine. There is a model developed that Indian companies who have a GMP facilities, we negotiated with them through the Bill Gates Foundation, Indo-US program, and finally we said that you should supply by $0.50. We will bear clinical costs, we will bear clinical trial costs, other things, but as a manufacturer, you should not sell it more than $1. Finally, the company has worked out in such a way in India that it is produced by almost $0.50. Today it is introduced in the National Immunization Program. So there are many examples in agriculture, industry, healthcare, where bilateral relationship with industrial relationship, industrial partnerships, and a very sound agreements nowadays, because very disciplined way of doing international collaboration has entered in. So in this disciplined way, there are no losses and no profits. Everybody is at profit. And as a result, we can definitely hope for using science for diplomacy, or diplomacy for science, whatever you call, for making the world more happier in terms of providing healthcare and agriculture products to one and all.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Rao. Now the floor is open, and please have as many questions as you want. We have almost 20-25 minutes, and I think we can move on. I see Professor Thomas Porgy, Professor W.P.S. Sidhu already raising hands, so let the professors capture the floor first.
I'm happy to let the students speak first if there is one. So this is a question for Mr. Jairam Ramesh. And first I wanted to say that colleagues at Yale have just done a study on the Montreal Protocol and found that it hasn't actually reversed. The size of the hole is still about the same, but it has certainly been arrested, and that was the very crucial thing. So your point stands. The Montreal Protocol is vastly more successful than the efforts to achieve the Paris Agreement. Now, why is that discrepancy there? I think you said something at the very end which explains that beautifully. You said that when you went there to talk with your colleagues, all your colleagues had a priority ranking. They said, my sovereignty first, my economic interests second, and the ecology third. And then the problem is, of course, that you have to find a distribution of costs and burdens that is sufficient to solve the problem of climate change, and nevertheless doesn't burden any one agent so much that the burden that they face is greater than the benefit that they get. So think for a moment of a simplified world in which you have two countries. One is called Switzerland, the other is called Bangladesh. Switzerland is producing a lot of emissions. They're driving cars, they're flying around in airplanes and so on. Bangladesh is a much poorer country. If climate change goes on unarrested, then of course Switzerland will have a pretty good time. It doesn't really matter much to them. It gets a little warmer, so the skiing starts a little later, but it's not a big deal. Whereas for Bangladesh, this is the very material basis for their existence. And so if diplomats from both sides think as you did, then what happens, right? The Bangladeshis will have to pay the Swiss to reduce their climate changing emissions. That's the only way forward. And to that, there are two problems. One problem is the Bangladeshis don't have that kind of money. And the second problem is that it's morally outrageous. And so it would be very difficult for the Bangladeshi government to explain to the Bangladeshis why they should pay a lot of money to Switzerland so that they reduce their climate changing emissions. So how can we solve that? How can we...
Well, first of all, I thank you for the correction. It's not my contention to say that the ozone depletion has been, the depletion of the ozone layer has stopped. I mean, the depletion is taking place at a decelerating rate. I mean, that's a more accurate statement to make. But the fact remains that the Montreal Protocol is a very successful example of international diplomacy when it came to fixing a problem of the global commons. Now, you know, in diplomacy, in international negotiations, you have two broad models. You have the top-down model, which was the Kyoto architecture, which is countries get together and decide on targets or actions to be undertaken by each individual country. Or you have a bottom-up architecture, where countries take on voluntary obligations and hold themselves internationally accountable. For 15 years, the international community tried to negotiate an international climate change agreement based on the top-down architecture. Copenhagen marked a paradigm shift. Copenhagen architecture rejected the top-down approach, but adopted the bottom-up approach, which said countries will take on voluntary commitments, but will hold themselves accountable internationally. And the reason for this paradigm shift was because of the political reality. I mean, the fact is that no country, when I say no country, I'm not including Bangladesh or Maldives, no big fossil fuel, global warming emitting, CO2 emitting country like the United States or China or India or South Africa would actually go and negotiate something which would mean a slowing down of economic growth. I mean, this is a political reality. So when you have, this is a trilemma, you know, it's an impossible trilemma. You either have political sovereignty and economic growth, and you give up some aspect of environmental objectives, or you have environment and politics, give up economic growth, or you have economic growth and environment and give up political sovereignty. So you can't have all three at the same time. I think it's an impossible trilemma in international negotiations. But I agree with you. The Paris Agreement is an agreement that every country is comfortable with politically. The Paris Agreement, contrary to what President Trump has said, is not going to impose an economic burden on any country. It's a suboptimal environmental agreement. No question about it. No question. No question that Bangladesh, Maldives, Solomon Islands, some of the small African states, from their point of view, this agreement is not in their best interest. But this is the best we could do. This is the best that could be done in a multilateral setting, you know, where all 193 countries could come on to. I mean, so I don't disagree with you. I mean, I wish we had had a better agreement, but the politics of it militated against it.
Professor Sidhu.
Thank you very much to a superb set of presentations from the panelists. Very much appreciated. I have a question for both Jairam Ramesh and Professor Rao. I totally agree with the three sort of factors that you mentioned. I think there may be, if you would permit, perhaps a fourth factor, which is equally important, the role of leadership. You talked about how any agreement is the second best, not the first, but it could be the last best. The fact that it's in fact the second best, I think there is got to be an element of leadership playing a role there as well. And the desire of countries, for example, like India, to become rule shapers rather than just rule blockers, or, you know, sort of not be participating in any way, shape, or form. So perhaps your comments on that, and particularly in the transition from Copenhagen, Cancun to Paris, where there was change in government, and the fact that whether, that sense of leadership has continued, because as you know, there was quite a bit of resistance within the country to Paris. But the fact that, the Prime Minister in particular has sort of decided almost unilaterally that he wants to go forward with that, whereas another president has taken another sort of role, the role of continuity in a way. And Dr. Rao, you pointed out, I think very importantly, the role of stakeholders. The one phrase you didn't perhaps use before that is multiple stakeholders. But you did mention that in the fact of, now there are organizations like the Gates Foundation, Dr. Chaturvedi mentioned in his opening remarks, the Solar Alliance, the fact that, you now have a multiplicity of actors who are working on some of these issues. So perhaps the question to you is it perhaps time that scientists also need to become diplomats in trying to work this multi-stakeholder model, both within the country, as you suggested, but also globally? Thank you.
Well, a good example of scientists becoming diplomats is the IPCC. Because it's a very good example of where science intersects with politics, science intersects with diplomacy, and at Copenhagen, all the negotiators were saying, but science has said this, but science has established this. So that's a good example of where science was mobilized for political objectives. No, I mean, the question that you have raised, WPS, the thing is that my experience was that, as I said, the top-down architecture just doesn't work because countries are not willing to make the adjustments, the political adjustments and the economic adjustments. So however much we may think that we need to do something to curb global warming, for instance, it was unlikely, and the experience from the mid-90s was this. And therefore we needed to break from the past. And that's why I said at Copenhagen, a conscious decision was taken by the countries, by a group of countries, saying that if you want an agreement, you must recognize the limits to which countries are able to commit actions as part of an international accord. So there was a paradigm shift. Incidentally, the point that you make is absolutely true, that the stand that India took at Copenhagen was bitterly criticized by some of my friends, colleagues, and I was criticized in Copenhagen for bartering away India's sovereignty, but the very same people welcomed the Paris Accord. So, in 6 years' time, the discourse shifted. And what was deemed unacceptable in 2009 became palatable and became part of the consciousness in 2015. So yes, I mean, people change over a period of time. We changed for the good. The United States changed in the reverse direction.
In fact, I think the best example is IPCC. But within the countries, there are academies of science who basically discuss science rather than technology and product. The multi-stakeholder platform comes when you have a technology, science becomes technology, and product development. So many organizations, science management bodies do have multi-stakeholder platforms. But what was I worried was, most of these scientists, IPCC is an exception. In most of the other cases, scientists shy away from these international regimes. For example, everybody comes to us in the government. The scientific community says that the biodiversity is a big hurdle for us, biodiversity loss, because we can't even do a research, because what used to be exchanged as a biological material in 1 month, now it takes 8 months, because you have so many bureaucratic approvals that you have to take. But yet, they collectively don't speak out. But you are right that in product development and technology, there is no way, either it is international one or is it a bilateral one, multilateral one, the multi-stakeholder platforms are must. You should have people from industry, you should have funding agencies, you should have people who are at the downstream, who are clinicians in case of healthcare. So all of them have to come together to decide upon how the technology is feasible. So it is happening already.
By the way, one of the key lessons that I learned was that, scientists are the best politicians. And there was a lot of politics going on in the IPCC. To think that there is a world of science and there is a world of politics and the two are entirely separate is not true. And one of the lessons, the key takeaways I had was that a country like India has to build its own scientific capacity to look at what's happening to global warming, rather than be led by the so-called value neutral science. I mean, there's no such thing as value neutral science, There's always some agenda somewhere in the science. And one of the things that unless we are in a position, I'll give you an example. The IPCC report said that the Himalayan glaciers would become extinct by the year 2035. And when I became minister, I was aghast when I saw this obviously political statement, a completely non-scientific statement. And I got our own scientists involved, and they said that there is no scientific way. Glaciers are under retreat, but to say that glaciers are going to vanish by 2035 is an absurd statement to make. And India was able to negotiate from a position of strength. So I think it's very important to recognize that science is not. People can use science for political purposes, which was what was happening until so many of these things were challenged.
Can be reverse also.
Yeah, absolutely.
Politicians using science for their purposes.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, and I would like to thank our speakers for these interesting interactions. Angelina Hovhannisyan, I'm the head of Foreign Relations Division of the Ministry of Education and Science. I'm also the graduate of Diplomatic School of Ministry of Foreign Affairs and a graduate of European College of European Union. What do you think? I think that sometimes dealing with science diplomacy, the country in itself deals with two levels, so political decision and scientific decision. I don't think that US decision about Paris decision was scientific. It is political, it is my opinion. But I think that in issues like this, the country, you mentioned the hierarchy for all countries, but I think that the priority of each country shouldn't be the same. Maybe for one country, being against of Paris decision is also a priority, and they do not deal with the scientific in their country. This was not the decision of US scientists. It was just US political decision to be against any Parisian decision. This is my opinion. But I think that in science diplomacy, before coming to any kind of discussions, every country, developing countries, developed countries, they have a special list of priorities, whether to promote their decision, where to be against this decision, or whether to follow its decision. I'm sure you are aware about the Horizon 2020 project, which is trying to make one area for European countries' scientific organizations. I would like to know whether there is such kind of unique platform for scientific, not decisions, but for scientific projects. So just to put it in 2 words, whether it is possible for scientific organizations of different countries to have some cooperational programs with Indian or with multilateral projects. Do you have any unique platform in India where the other countries can participate? Thank you.
Well, I think, let me address your point this way. As I mentioned right at the beginning, you can have, as part of international agreements, you can have a plurilateral agreement, which is a group of countries get together and decide to do something and keep some countries out and let them join whenever they feel comfortable. Or you have a multilateral agreement where every country has. Now, there are certain issues, certain global issues, which necessarily have to be multilateral. Now, for example, the United Nations has just approved by majority vote a treaty to abolish nuclear weapons. Now, it's a great agreement, but the United States is not part of it. Russia is not part of it. India is not part of it. China is not part of it. France is not part of it. Israel, Pakistan, 9 countries are not part of it. So what good is it to pass an agreement plurilaterally when the big guys who are actually responsible are not part of it? So there are certain issues, and environmental issues, certainly one of those issues, in which everybody has a stake. And therefore, even if there is one free rider, the agreement really falls. So you have to somehow create the conditions in which everybody has a stake. There'll always be 1 or 2 countries. This was true in Copenhagen. This is also true in Paris, by the way. There were 2 countries, actually, which were very reluctant to come on. But finally, they did come on. So the end is always not guaranteed. For example, almost 20 years ago, we started the Doha round of trade negotiations. And the Doha round has got nowhere because everybody has to be part of it. You don't have the agreement till you have nothing. As I said, nothing is agreed till everything gets agreed. So this is the nature of international agreements. And this is the nature of international agreements which are intergovernmental in nature. You can have agreements of a different variety, but where governments are the major actors, this is the inherent limitation in these agreements. Now, sub-alliances do get formed. For example, in Copenhagen, India, South Africa, Brazil, and China. It's called the Basic Group. The 4 countries got together and basically negotiated the Copenhagen Accord with the United States. So in different negotiations, you have different players, you have different groups. And these groups then try to maximize their own interest. But ultimately, all this has to feed into one agreement. It cannot be a series of sub-agreements that becomes an agreement. It has to be one agreement that is applicable and it is acceptable to all parties.
Thank you. I would just have 2 more questions, 3. So 1, Pedro, you, and 3, and then we would close. So Pedro.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Pedro Silva. I am the head of the Science Technology section of the Brazilian Embassy here in New Delhi. My question is to Ambassador Sinha. In recent years, we have seen a tendency, especially in developed countries, to decrease their focus in science diplomacy and increase the focus in innovation diplomacy. As a matter of fact, many of my counterparts here in the New Delhi diplomatic community are not anymore called science technology counselors, but innovation counselors. And in general terms, I think this means targeting cooperation more towards the production of products, solutions that will have ultimately a economic or social benefit, rather than targeting cooperation that would lead to production of papers and basically it. So I would like to ask how you see the Indian diplomacy in that aspect, and whether this should be a tendency to be followed also by other developing countries?
Own perspective, yes, we have also seen the shift. It is more a change of focus. Even in science, we always have this problem that how do you take scientific knowledge or, from lab to farm? That transmission of knowledge from laboratories to actual implementation was always there, and that's a domestic issue. Globally, too, in fact, you see some of the recent engagements that we have on science and technology. Two clear examples are with the US, and plus we had the Global Innovation Summit with Israel, where principally the focus was on practical uses of science for creating wealth. And I think it's not a bad idea, but that does not preclude cooperation in pure sciences. No, it just builds on. Ultimately, for innovation also, science remains the basic or the basis. Would you agree with that?
In fact, there are two types we distinguish. One, discovery-led innovation, where you have a long-term, and that is usually done within the countries, or at the most in a bilateral way. Like we have some collaboration with Indo-US. We have collaboration with Brazil. We have collaboration with many other countries. Now, when I started international in the government, it was only 4 or 5 countries. Now today India collaborates with something like, in biotechnology, about 70 countries. Small, big, everybody. But if I classify, you are right, if I classify them out of 70, almost 70% are mostly towards technology perfection, validation, clinical trials, product development, and then exchange of regulations, scientific risk assessments, bio-risk assessment. It's all on the translational science towards the product development science and the regulatory domain. In fact, we do have a lot of discussions on biosafety capacity building. We have discussions on how to do science of risk assessment with these countries. So they are all integral part of innovation where product can comfortably and deployed into the market. So because we also look at markets beyond India, so for that collaboration becomes also very key.
Thank you very much, sir. Good morning. My name is King David Karati, and I work as a research officer and a special aide to a minister for monitoring and evaluation in the office of the president, Ghana, who also doubles as a member of parliament. So clearly, I'm coming from the political side. So greetings goes to Dr. Jamir. My question is, now it is clearly established that there's a bit of difficulty realigning science and then diplomacy in terms of negotiations and going to the diplomatic tables. So I want to know that, is there anything that we are actually putting in place from the political sector where we are going to allow the scientists or the scientific conclusions to also underpin our diplomatic negotiations and the relations when we go to the negotiation table, so that it doesn't happen that the politicians only go with a sense of achieving the political stability or a political context in the terms of discussions, but then together we are going to achieve the scientific research understanding and the political fit. Are the politicians going to allow that? And then if they are going to do that, how do we go about it in terms of the realignment? Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. My name is Matt Cohen with the NYU group. And my question may force you to be redundant slightly, so I apologize if that's the case. But my question was on the politicization of science. I'm an American, and as you all know, that issue, not just climate change, but many scientific issues have been very much politicized in the United States. And being science-friendly is part of what being on the left means, and vice versa. And I'm overgeneralizing, but so I was wondering, maybe for the more politically focused gentlemen on the panel, how do communications to the general public need to be managed so that those stratifications don't occur? And because it's created a sort of a toxic environment in my country. I'm not sure how it is here. So.
In fact, science communication to the public to allay the fears of several technologies has become a very challenging thing for us. The most controversial and contradictory statements come from, because there is also simultaneous to international agreements and others, there are many activist organizations which have come in the place for anti-science, anti-technology, and they talk idealism and many things, religious grounds and several grounds. So it becomes a very big challenge. I think we are also facing that how to actually plan communication strategy. Either you take genetically engineered products, whether you take future technologies like genome editing, even the technology is just being seeded. There's already a lot of discussions going on all over the world about whether it is useful, whether it is harmful. So I think to me, the policymakers have to be the first target to communicate. Then comes the public.
Well, just to take both these questions together, and to go back to what I said, I think scientific issues are basically political issues. So I'm not terribly bothered about the politicization of science. And let's take an example which we've been grappling with, genetically modified crops, right? It's a scientific issue. It's a biotechnology issue. But actually, it's a deeply political issue as well. There are consumers involved, there are activists involved, there are farmers involved, there are scientists involved. And 40 years ago, when the Green Revolution first happened, this was not the case. It was seen to be a straightforward lab-to-land issue. Scientists had developed new varieties of rice and wheat. You had to give it to the farmers, and the farmers will start producing the rice and wheat. But that's no longer the case. Today we are talking of regulation, we are talking of, so many issues that go outside the traditional concern or domain of science. So that's what I mean when I say that we may have good understanding of science, but when you take that into the larger field of policy, politics does begin to play. And you can see in the case of genetically modified crops, for example, the US has one approach, the Europeans have a completely different approach, and we have a third approach. So every country tries to work its approach depending on the politics, depending on the stakeholders, depending on the relative power of So I think how science interfaces with society, how science interfaces with different stakeholders in society is becoming a key determinant of how acceptable that science is. And whether it's climate change, whether it's agriculture, whether it's pharmaceuticals, all this, the examples abound where scientists think that they have the scientific solutions and they are frustrated because those scientific solutions are not seeing the light of day. They're not seeing the light of day because of very many other factors that may not have been part of the scientist's original calculus. So I think, science, when countries negotiate, the question that you asked, basically you assume that you're negotiating on the basis of the best available information at that point of time. So, in the case of the Montreal Protocol, in the case of climate change, every country, whether it was Ghana, whether it was India, whether it was the United States or Switzerland or Bangladesh, was taking certain political positions, but backed by a certain degree of scientific knowledge. In the case of Bangladesh, for example, the scientific knowledge was that low-lying area, increase in mean sea levels would mean the loss of livelihoods of millions of people. That was established by science. So in many of these cases, there is a scientific consensus. There is enough body of scientific knowledge which the politicians, which the negotiators are able to mobilize. But ultimately, as I said, there are trade-offs. These are not pure discussions of science. There's politics involved, there's economics involved, and science may end up taking a backseat, you know.
Thank you, Dr. Rao. Any comment? Ambassador Sinha, can we have your closing remarks?
I guess to build on what the minister said, you see, if the impact of any product is immediate, for example, I think it's common sense that you won't consume poison because you die immediately. But with cigarette, despite warning, you'll consume because the impact is over long term and it is uncertain, and you can't really correlate your death to smoking. I think a similar situation prevails in climate change. If there's an earthquake, every government will immediately come together for disaster relief because it is visible, it is immediate. A disaster related to climate change, there will be politics. And that is true in negotiations, there is a hierarchy. Ideal situation would be that the hierarchy was inverted, so that when we went to negotiations, we knew why we are here for. We are here for climate change issues, but unfortunately that doesn't happen. That is because the impact is not immediate and evident, unlike, say, in any other tsunami or earthquake. And the other thing, the science, the politicization, but more important, the use of science in economics is even more widespread. In fact, to give you an example from India, when we were growing up, we used to have this ghee. Then scientific papers came that ghee is pathetic, it'll lead to heart attacks and obesity, moved to refined vegetable oil. Then came that only soya-bean oil, only sunflower oil. Today, there are papers which are saying, you know, actually ghee was much better because it has a low density cholesterol, which is better. So people are perplexed. Half of it is driven by commercial interests. If I can plant doubts about a product in your mind, I have gained that much of market for my own product. Now, how to control it? Well, it is very similar in other domains. No, President Trump himself says, era of fake news, post-truth. How do you check that? Unless there is a very robust peer review, and the basis of that science is sort of certified, consumer will be misled. And that is something we'll all have to deal with in today, like we are dealing with all sorts of news and WhatsApp groups and social media. Well, thank you very much, and I hope you all enjoyed this session. And thanks to RIS for getting together such an eminent panel. And please join us for, do we have a cup of tea break now? We have a tea break now. Please, thank you.
So please enjoy tea and coffee here. We have a 15-minute break, and 11:30 we would come back here. Thank you.